Hey guys, pardon the meme, I had to take the chance to trigger some weebs before I got into the meat of the matter. In all honesty though, that meme and even the sensational title I used are not a very good presentation of how I feel about the Rebuild. Taken as a whole, I really don't like the Rebuild story. But I think there are a lot of positive aspects to it, and I'm happy to say that I got a lot out of the Rebuild, even if I didn't like the direction it went. So today, I'm going to explore the Neon Genesis Evangelion Rebuild, why it fails as a story, and why, despite that failure, I'm still very grateful that it exists. Let's get started. I am like many Neon Genesis Evangelion fans in that I have a love-hate relationship with this anime. After my first viewing of the 1995 original, I came away confused, disappointed, and kind of angry at the lack of clarity and closure I received from the story as a whole. But at the same time, I felt that I had just witnessed something rather special. I just couldn't put my finger on any particular reason why. It took me diving into a second viewing 3 months later to finally start drilling down on what chaotic cocktail of factors drew me so heavily to the story, in spite of my initial bewilderment. And it was only after this second viewing that I began to consider Neon Genesis Evangelion a true masterpiece, albeit one that did not conform to traditional definitions of masterful storytelling. Kind of like a masterwork avant-garde art piece rather than a traditional example of artistic genius. My love for Eva was kind of a slow burn, but I did eventually reach a point where I had to admit its brilliance, and found that somewhere along the way, it had become one of my favorite stories. All of that leads us to the arrival of the Eva Rebuild. I love Neon Genesis Evangelion, but I do not love these movies. Alright, that's not fair, really. In all honesty, I like 3 out of the 4 films. It's just when they're taken together as a whole that they really crash and burn. 1.11 was an excellent reboot. There was nothing new or groundbreaking about it. It was basically just a concise, visually updated version of the first third of the original show. At this point, there was no reason to suspect that Gainax was going to do anything but give Eva a glossy new set of visuals, and I think Eva fans were fine with that. Then 2.0 hit, and this was where things started to get interesting. Guys, I loved this film. 2.22 was fantastic. It stayed true to the soul of the original while making clear and deliberate moves into unexplored territory. Not only did they start to delve more into many characters, they also introduced whole new ones, and made it abundantly clear that this would be a different story altogether, making subtle and radical changes that somehow managed to put the story on a drastically different path while still feeling authentic to Eva's tone and style. It's really quite a well-executed and breathtaking film, giving us new, exciting possibilities while still staying true to the core aspects that make Eva work. In 2.22's version of events, it seems we're finally getting a Shinji who is learning to be the hero he needs to be.
I don't care what happens to me. I don't even care what happens to the world. But I'm bringing Rei back. I promise I'll save you, Rei, even if it's the last thing I do.
And the prospects for where the Rebuild could go after 2.0's rather shocking conclusion were incredibly compelling. I had never been so excited to watch another Evangelion movie. My body was ready for 3.0. And then I watched it. and sat in utter, absolute horror as every promising possibility from 2.2 burned to the ground in one of the worst movies I have ever seen. That's not to say there's nothing good about it. It looks gorgeous. Its music is fantastic, and the piano sequence between Shinji and Kaoru is utterly brilliant. And that is where the positives end. 3.33 was an absolute nightmare. A dumpster fire burning all of the Rebuild's character development, nuance, plot progression, and potential into husks more charred than Luke Skywalker's aunt and uncle. I don't even know where to start when talking about how badly this movie screwed everything the Rebuild had going for it. The damage 3.3 did to the overall story cannot be overemphasized. It is absolutely terrible. So suddenly I found myself at a new low in my expectations for Eva, where just at the credit roll of the previous film, I had been at an all-time high. I've never seen an installment destroy a series quite so quickly. In my mind, there was simply no way that the last film could ever save the series from the bottomless pit in which 3 had left it. It was simply too drastic a disaster, leaving the plot, characters, and world building in such shambles that it couldn't possibly recover. And luckily, I was a little bit wrong about that. 4 turned out to be quite a good film. Its attempts at recovery are pretty strong, and it leaves us with a thought-provoking ending. Unfortunately, it couldn't come anywhere close to salvaging the story from 3.3's wreckage, but it put a brave face on it, and did a decent job of leaving audiences with positive things to remember about the new Eva series. A far cry from an embarrassment that needed to be swept under the rug, but also far from another masterpiece on par with the original. So that's my rundown of the Rebuilds. It was a wild ride, going from a nice visual reboot to the budding of a new masterpiece, to that fragile seed of a masterpiece being stomped into the dirt, then finally kind of propped back up with as much tape and glue as possible into something somewhat compelling. But what specifically are my problems with the Rebuild? What did it do so wrong, particularly in its third installment, that makes it a failure? Here's the deal. With anything Eva, whether you're watching the original show, End of Evangelion, or the Rebuild, the main story is not the plot playing out on the screen, but the meta-narrative behind that plot. In fact, the original Eva's meta-narrative on inner struggles is what makes it a masterpiece. Not its cool kaiju mechas, not its intriguing world building, not its convoluted real-world plot of survival against the angels, and certainly not all its unanswered mysteries. Neon Genesis Evangelion is a masterpiece because of its meta-commentary on the human condition. The original show was a character study, but the Rebuild is a franchise introspection, and both of their meta-narratives reflect their respective messages. But the difference here is in the execution. I really appreciate the Rebuild's attempts to provide meta-commentary on the franchise as a whole, on its impact, and on the journey of Eva's creator. But the execution of that meta-narrative, unlike the original's examination of the human psyche, is not executed well. And that's one of my main issues with the Rebuild. Its meta-narrative execution is not stellar. One of the reasons for this is simply because, by nature of being about the franchise introspection instead of a character study, it sacrifices a lot in the way of its character arcs. Shinji, Kaoru, and Rei 3 all have decently compelling progressions, but most other character arcs are almost entirely non-existent, such as Ritsuko and Mari Makanami, or changed to something simplistic and uncompelling, such as Asuka and Misato. Rei 2 had an excellent arc in 2.22, but then she disappeared for the entirety of the rest of the Rebuild, making any progression up to that point null and void. Mari's addition to the cast was an exciting one at first, because she represented new possibilities, but her role became more and more exclusively a meta-narrative device, instead of a unique character with story purpose. She basically functions as a symbol, a plot device meant to represent the world outside of Evangelion. And while that works well on paper with the franchise introspection meta-narrative, in practice it left us with a character that felt flat, and audiences had a hard time connecting with her. These criticisms haven't even begun to address the sheer lack of consistency in 3.0. Misato, Ritsuko, Asuka, and many others act completely out of character, opposite of who we know them to be, and opposite of simple common sense. Like, seriously, can just, one single person take a moment to explain what's going on to Shinji? There's never any revealed reason why they need to keep the events of the past from him. It would take, a few minutes tops, and all the nonsense in the third film just never happens. It was just so contrived, so out of character, and so devoid of common sense that I could hardly take anything seriously. We wouldn't be trying to stop Shinji from doing the stupid thing if you had just spent a few minutes telling him why not to do the stupid thing when you had him all to yourself at the beginning of the movie. Again, nothing in the plot of the third film made any sense. The whole thing could have easily never happened if just one person out of 100 decided not to be a moron. And we know from past experience that a lot of these people are not morons. But no. Instead, we needed another 30 minutes of futuristic battleship maneuvers and completely meaningless technobabble. Awesome. I'm going to move on before I blow a blood vessel trying to figure out what the actual F they were doing with this movie. Now, I hate to keep comparing the rebuild to the original, but it's kind of inevitable in a situation like this. One thing the original Eva never did is try to appeal to traditional audiences. What made it the groundbreaking show that it was is its refusal to abide by normal, accepted storytelling methods. And Hideaki Anno's insistence on focusing on the meta-commentary reflects that. The rebuild, however, does exactly the opposite. Gainax started pandering to more traditional viewers, trying to rope in larger audiences by including what they think lots of people want to see. Namely, large-scale, high-budget action pieces and gratuitous fan service. A large action spectacle devoid of story purpose is what I refer to as a Michael Bay action scene. And unfortunately, 3.33 and 4.44 are full of them. Guys, I've said it a million times, and I'll say it a million times more. Breathtaking fight scenes with no meaning to them do not a better movie make. They actually hurt your story by killing its pacing and by introducing conflict without providing any stakes. It's putting a beautiful layer of icing over a cake made of sawdust. Sure, it looks gorgeous when first viewed, but ultimately leaves you with a bad taste in your mouth. There were no fundamental storytelling ingredients baked into your story, just like there were no necessary ingredients like flour and sugar in the cake to make a truly tasty snack. Gorgeous as they are, the seemingly endless scenes of Asuka and Mari trashing a bunch of mob drones serve almost no purpose to the actual plot. And, more importantly, nor do they serve any purpose in the context of the meta-narrative. These types of meaningless fight scenes were there for one reason: to put new butts in seats, and it really shows. Oh, and speaking of butts,
You serious?
seriously though, I am not above enjoying a nice butt shot or boob jiggle.
Oh, God, it's so good. So good and tasty.
But why is all this fan service here? I'm not going to pretend like all the fan service in the original was some brilliant piece of meta-commentary, but by and large, it was there for a reason. Sometimes to act as Shinji's perspective of the tantalizing and intimidating women around him, and sometimes as a critique of otaku culture. The fan service in the rebuild serves no discernible purpose, which in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but it actually damages audience perception of the story Anno was trying to tell. Many viewers came away from the rebuild knowing Mari Makanami only as that hot boob and ass girl with the glasses, which tells us two things. One, her characterization, desires, and purpose in the story were not strong enough to get people invested in her, and two, the constant stream of fan service clearly overshadowed any other aspect of her character. It's okay to have sexualized characters. Many people in real life are overtly sexual people who have no qualms about flaunting their attractiveness. But having characters that exist solely for fan service and meta commentary leaves you with a distinctly flat character. And even if we're not discussing Mari in particular, some of the fan service is just completely tone deaf. Such as this shot of Sakura Suzuhara. Really? Really? Is this what the audience needs to be focused on at this particular moment? This extremely serious moment about a character having a mental breakdown? Having a crisis of faith in her commanding officer's decisions? We need to be thinking about how she looks bent over. Are you sure? It's just sloppy directing, and I love Neon Genesis Evangelion too much to simply handwave that kind of poor decision making. I feel like I'm being kind of harsh here. Because, as I said earlier, I liked a lot of what this series did and tried to do. For one, I really liked some of the new character designs. Asuka in a bomber jacket and eye patch is so badass. And, like I said, I thought some of the meta commentary on the journey of the franchise and Anno himself, while not executed perfectly, was very creative and heartfelt. And that commentary delivered a sense of closure that almost brought me to tears. After years of wrestling with the themes of this story and all the things it helped me get through in my life. The rebuild had a downright awful plot at times, but if there's anything that I can say I felt with certainty after finishing the final movie, it was a sense of peace. A sense of moving on. And I think that's what its goal was, to help people to move on. Both from the struggles within themselves and from Eva itself. So, maybe I was wrong. Maybe the rebuild isn't a failure after all. I think Eva fans will eventually come to appreciate the rebuild for what it is. Closure. The end of Neon Genesis Evangelion. A story that meant so much to many of us, and in many ways, held us captive to its presentation of things we couldn't express but always felt. But I don't think the rebuild will go down in history like its predecessor. It's just not that level of masterpiece. It will mostly be forgotten by larger audiences within a decade or two. The exception to that, I think, will be those longtime fans of Eva who will always be grateful for a heartfelt, if flawed, conclusion to a longtime obsession. Goodbye, Neon Genesis Evangelion.